There are ordinary mornings that go on record as ordinary: coffee, toast, the same old kiss that lingers just long enough. And there are mornings that, like a hairline fault in a glass window, let in a sliver of light bright enough to show how thin everything around it really is. Emily Hart had been living inside one of those glittering ordinary mornings for 6 years. She lived in a craftsman house 2 blocks from a maple-lined park in suburban Connecticut, worked part-time at a non-profit that helped adolescents learn job skills, and had a closet of dresses for Sunday brunches and office meetings. Her husband, Mark, was 2 years older, had an easy laugh, and a job at a mid-sized tech company that had managed to grow faster than his self-effacing ambition. Together they had built a life that looked smooth and polished to anyone who glanced at it: a wedding photo on the mantel, a dog named Rufus matching mugs. Emily liked the way the light hit the hardwood floors in the afternoons. She thought she liked Mark. She liked how he left the toothpaste cap off and how he could assemble an IKEA bookshelf without cursing too loudly. On an early September morning, the kind where the humidity clung to the air like a memory, Emily found a receipt in Mark's jacket pocket. It was for dinner, 2 bowls at a restaurant in the city, a place she and Mark had never been to, and the time stamped late. After 1 a.m. she squinted at the receipt, the numbers, the signature line blurred with a pen, a notation: Room 1204. Her heart didn't leap. Instead, it took a small, calculating breath. Mark came home later that day carrying the grin he reserved for small triumphs. He kissed her and asked about her day, about whether Rufus had eaten the leftover chicken. The ordinary machinery of their life turned, the dishwasher hummed, the late sun fell through the blinds. Emily tucked the receipt into a drawer. She was not a woman of dramatic gestures. The life she'd built had been assembled with small, careful decisions. If something was out of place, she would catalogue it, understand it, assess her options. The next week there were hints: the faint perfume clinging to Mark's jacket, the colour of warm jasmine. She knew his soap. This wasn't that. A credit card charge for a chain of expensive florists who never delivered to their zip code. A sudden interest in networking dinners that coincided with nights he claimed to be at business mixers. Mark's phone became a vault. He started answering it in another room. He grew evasive when she asked about his calendar. He began to work more late-night hours. Emily's father had taught her to trust evidence, not feelings. He had been an engineer who could make a blueprint of any problem and then patiently disassemble it into solvable parts. Emily began to gather receipts, times, messages, little inconsistencies that fit together like puzzle pieces, clicking slow and inevitable into place. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but sometimes when enough pieces line up, a picture emerges whether you want to see it or not. On a rainy Thursday, she found the thread that snapped the net: a photograph tucked into the lining of a coat in the closet. It was small and glossy, like those that came out of drugstore cameras. Mark was in it, laughing, his arm around a woman Emily had never seen, a woman with hair the colour of midnight, and a sultry curve to her smile that made the edges of Emily's world go a little hazy. There are moments when anger arrives like heat, there are others when it is ice. For Emily it was neither at first. It came as calculation. The smile in the photograph was a trespass, the evidence was impossible to ignore. She folded the picture, put it in her palm, and went to sit at the kitchen table with a notebook. She began to record everything. Not a diary of emotion, not yet. A ledger, dates, times, receipts, descriptions. She called it a count. The list became both a map and a weapon. Business dinner with Carla Ames, 2 times recorded on the company calendar but no team members listed. Hotel charges in the city with room numbers, odd messages that were deleted but appeared in the trash bin of Mark's laptop as fragments. Mark noticed nothing at first. He came home with bouquets on a Sunday and an apologetic text one evening that said, "Work has been insane, I promise we'll plan something." He started to ask for privacy and time and understood reasons Emily didn't offer. He wanted the ordinary morning back. But ordinary mornings, once cracked, never quite reseal the same way. The first conversation, when it came, was quiet and lean. Emily had rehearsed nothing. She simply placed the photograph and the receipt on the table, closed her notebook to make a single, heavy sound. "Who is this?" she asked. Mark blinked, looked at the picture, then at the receipt, then at Emily. "It's not what you think," he said. He had that soft, practiced tone of someone who had been conjuring excuses for years. It was the tone Emily recognized from every small lie that adds up over time. "Tell me," she said. Mark's defense folded like a bad script. He admitted to the affair, a nameless, sloppy confession that made his voice small. The woman was a co-worker. It had started as lunches and texts and then, It just happened, he offered, as if infidelity were a gust of wind that passed through. Emily listened. She didn't interrupt. He said the things men say when they want warmth back. It was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to happen. I'm sorry. He apologized with the mechanized cadence of someone who had practiced remorse, but who lacked the vocabulary for the kind of hurt he had caused. After he slept on the couch, Emily sat in the dark and thought about the long ledger in the kitchen drawer. She had always believed life could be fixed with evidence and the right action. The confession had changed her options from hypothetical to urgent. What most people want after betrayal is two things that are often at odds: closure and validation. Closure can sometimes be bought with tenderness or time. Validation, the desire to have your reality recognized by the world, often needs proof and sometimes spectacle. Emily did not want to be pitied or to build drama. She wanted justice that fit the scale of the trespass, a quiet, thorough dismantling of the life Mark had assumed. She closed the notebook again, but this time with a new plan sketched at the margin. She would not be loud, she would be precise. Revenge, as she planned it, would be an economy of consequences, enough to ensure Mark could not simply return to the life he'd betrayed with a casual shrug. Revenge does not always require a villain to be dramatic. Sometimes it is an elaborate exercise in self-repair. Emily's first move was to create distance. She had no interest in a courtroom spectacle or in exposing Mark in a public forum where their family, neighbors, and colleagues would spill gossip and ruin belonged to both of them. She wanted something that would rebalance the ledger and leave her the author of the next chapter of her own life. Emily began by reclaiming the practical details of their existence. She studied their finances. It turned out, to her surprise and temporary fury, that Mark had been the primary access holder to their joint account. She made neat mental notes of the bills paid, the assets that bore both their names, and the few accounts that were only in Mark's. She could have called the bank and started shouting, but she knew the law's gears turned slowly and unpredictably. Instead, she opened a new savings account in her name, transferred a modest sum she had forgotten she owned, a savings stash she had tucked away after college, and began a reinvestment plan. She scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor, someone recommended by a friend at the non-profit. She learned how to read APRs and amortization tables, the dull arithmetic that smelled faintly of power. When Mark's company offered him an overseas client trip, Emily smiled and told him to go. She wanted him to leave their shared calendar in his phone. While he was away, texting a thin thread of apology into the nighttime zones, she met with a lawyer. The lawyer was not the shouty, dramatic type Emily had feared. He was brisk and efficient and explained that what she wanted, security, separation if necessary, an equitable division of assets, was possible. He also explained that the best revenge was to build a life that made the past irrelevant. So Emily began to build that life. She wrote an updated resume, cleaned up the LinkedIn profile she'd let languish, and applied for a fellowship she had long admired, a leadership incubator in Boston for women working in social enterprise. She did not tell Mark she was applying. Ambition was a language they had stopped speaking together. It would have been simpler, she told herself, to walk away in fury and wreckage, but she'd grown up watching her mother rebuild after failed romances, sometimes messy and vindictive, sometimes tender and quiet. Emily chose the latter route, in part because it suited her temperament, and in part because she wanted her revenge to be something that outlived him. She wanted to rise and have him see it. The weeks unfurled like a length of film. Mark, sensing the world narrowing for him at home, tried to be accommodating. He suggested counseling. He asked at one point if she would consider couples therapy. Emily agreed but reserved the right to more than one counselor. Private therapy, she told him, was different from the ledger she was keeping. The first sessions were performative from both of them, the man who had confessed and the woman who listened. Mark's remorse oscillated between sincere and performative. Emily learned to watch his eyes for the truth. When the fellowship accepted her application, a crisp email that arrived on a Tuesday, Emily felt a calibration inside her chest, equal parts exhilaration and the cold comfort of proof. She had a ticket out, not to run but to return, newly skilled and independently secure. She did not tell Mark right away. Instead, she arranged the fellowship's start date to coincide with the moment Mark's company announced a promotion, a vice president role he had coveted and finally achieved. He took the promotion and the accompanying trip to San Francisco with a vicarious sense of success. He arrived home tired, smiling, and unaware that the map of their lives had already been partially redrawn. There was a small cruelty in Emily's restraint. She let him bask for a little while, let the first flush of success make his shoulders broader. She cooked his favorite meals, laughed at his stories about meetings, and maintained an outward calm that both irritated and soothed him. He smelled of cologne again when he came home. He bought flowers. He tried, pathetically and sincerely, to convince her that he was done. At their 1-month couples therapy session, the therapist, a middle-aged man with a soft voice and an uncanny ability to ask the right brusque question, asked a simple thing. If you were to make a fair deal here, what would it look like? Emily surprised herself by answering without hesitation. Independence, she said. Financial separation initially. A pause to determine whether we can be partners in a marriage in which there is trust. For now, privacy for each of us and clear honesty. If he wants forgiveness, he will have to show it through actions. Mark's mouth twitched. He said, "I will do anything," which was less comforting than he meant it to be. After therapy, Emily executed the practical steps she had discussed in the lawyer's office. She transferred assets into accounts in her name where possible. She called her company's HR to ask about flexible leave for the fellowship and lined up a mentor in Boston. She taught herself to be meticulous in a way she'd never been, like someone who had decided to build a house from the foundation up and would not, under any circumstances, let a rotten joist remain. The revenge at this stage was not melodramatic. It wasn't a viral moment of humiliation. It was quiet and surgical. She dismantled dependency and replaced it with capability. She learned to enjoy her own company in a way she hadn't since college. She read books on negotiation and power dynamics. She took to running in the mornings and in the evenings, to painting small canvases of abstract colors that no one needed to see. Rufus became her secret accomplice, curling into her lap in the nights when the house felt too large. And somewhere in the cracks, Mark watched. He read the emails Emily didn't send him for days. He saw her paying attention to the details he had ignored. He tried to be grander: dinners, apologies, earnest letters. But apologies without structural change are like paper over a leaking roof. Marks of effort that didn't address the underlying rot only proved to Emily what she'd already known, that to rebuild, foundations must be changed. When Emily's fellowship began, she packed Mark a small note into his briefcase because she wanted him to see that she could be both civil and decisive. "I leave Monday," she wrote. "You have the house while I'm away. We will talk when I return." The note was more generous than she felt. She left anyway. Boston was a clean city for thinking in. Emily's days were full of lectures and workshops and other women who wanted to take up space in their industries. She learned tactics for organizational change, fundraising strategy, rhetoric that fit power. She listened to the stories of other women who had left marriages and come back stronger. She began to articulate her own story in a way that made it purposeful rather than hurtful. She used the memory of the photograph and the receipts not as a talisman for anger, but as the coal that stoked a fire of ambition. While she was away, Mark's life at home began to fray in other ways. His promotion required more time, trivializing the remorse he'd promised. He started bringing a different woman home, sometimes just to dinner, sometimes to the office, someone he thought discreet. But secrecy is a dangerous thing in a world wired with oversharing and casual messages. Mark's phone buzzed in the small hours more often now, and he fumbled with his evening routine. Neighborhood whispers noticed emptier nights. Mailboxes held packages meant for duplicates of their sort of life. Then the first true act of revenge, the one Emily had been building toward in small stages, landed in Mark's inbox like a small, clean bomb. It was an offer letter from a major social enterprise leadership position, the very board that had seen Emily's name during the fellowship and had been impressed by her combination of grit and strategy. The position would mean travel and a salary generous enough not to ask anyone for permission about the shape of her life. Emily accepted. She forwarded him the acceptance later, not out of triumph, but because moving without transparency felt cowardly, and because she wanted him to see that the ledger was changing. When she returned a month later, she found the house the same but different. Mark was there, thinner from stress, trying to be conciliatory and disappointed with himself in ways that didn't entirely make up for the choices he'd made. He sat Emily down and told her he had ended the affair. He said he understood that she had choices now. He looked at her with the mixture of selfish hunger and longing that characterized men who suddenly realized they'd traded treasure for trinkets. Emily listened and, like a good strategist, measured. He wanted her back. She wanted sovereignty. Their conversations became a negotiation where truth was the currency. Mark offered contrition, job flexibility, a promise to attend therapy with renewed fervor. Emily asked for documented evidence of change, accounts opened with transparent access, counseling sessions logged, a mutual agreement with deadlines and clear definitions for success. It was not dramatic, it required no grand gestures. It required accountability. At first Mark balked. He resented being measured, he resented being watched, but he saw how the world had shifted around Emily, how colleagues treated her with a new respect, how clients listened differently. Once, in the middle of a quiet dinner, she watched him realize fully that her life had a trajectory he had not included and could not easily derail. The knowledge changed him more than any apology he could muster. It would be easy to say Emily forgave him and that they lived happily ever after, but such an ending would miss something important. Revenge here was not about humiliation, it was about reclaiming narrative control and refusing to be minimized. Emily's victory ultimately came in the mundane things, the empowerment of making decisions, the small pleasures of unshared triumphs, and the way her friends looked at her now. It came in the moment she set her hand to a new company's letterhead and saw her name at the top as an equal. But Emily was not entirely devoid of spectacle. Life is equal parts strategy and theatre. She had learned to use both. She waited for the right moment. Revenge is not at base about getting even. It is about making a statement that the person who wronged you will not simply walk away untouched. Emily knew that there are two kinds of revenge, one that cheapens you and one that reconstructs you. She chose the latter. Still, there is always a place for the satisfying, clever reveal that makes the wrongdoer feel the weight of their own choices without reducing you to spite. Mark's promotion party was scheduled for a warm night in late spring at a downtown hotel ballroom. The guest list intentionally read like a roll call of the people who had made his career, colleagues, clients, and the occasional rival who liked to sip scotch and watch others win. He expected praise and the company perks that came with a VP title, speeches, toasts, a falling confetti of success. He also expected, absurdly, that he could stand in the glitter of that room and feel the marriage's wrongs dissolve like sugar on his tongue. Some men confuse applause with absolution. Emily had not planned to attend. She had the new job paperwork to sign the following morning and a training seminar midweek. But when Mark's company sent out the invitation, a glossy card that made his achievement look fated, a small, cold smile curved along Emily's mouth, the party would be the perfect place to make a demonstration, not of petty revenge, but of public recontextualization. She would make him meet the consequences of his actions in the court of those who had elevated him. She arrived at the party wearing a dress deliberately tasteful and unshowy, as if daring his colleagues to look beyond the surface. She had RSVP'd under her maiden name because she knew how simple details can unsettle. Mark saw her as soon as she walked in, his face registering a fast sequence of emotions: surprise, shame, anger, ersatz composure. He approached with a hand extended and an apology ready. Emily accepted the handshake and allowed the conversation to be brief, public, and cold. She wore the look of someone who had no intention of granting private absolution in public quarters. As the evening meandered through speeches, Mark took the stage. The crowd clapped politely. He spoke about hard work, synergy, mentorship, the kind of corporate platitudes that sound noble without demanding accountability. Emily watched him then with the quiet satisfaction of someone who held the final slide for the presentation. She had not arrived empty-handed. A week earlier she had reached out to a journalist friend she had made during the fellowship, a woman named Leela who now wrote a column on leadership culture and the ethics of corporate behavior. Leela's writing was trenchant and fair, and she had encouraged Emily to document everything. Emily had delivered. She had sent copies of receipts, photographs, and a thoughtful, clear narrative of the timeline in an email that read like a case study in betrayal and recovery. It was not salacious, it was evidence paired with reflection. Leela had asked if Emily would share her experience as part of a larger piece she was compiling about men in mid-level corporate leadership whose home lives undermined their workplaces. "It's not about shamming," Leela had said. "It's about understanding how private compromises affect public leadership." The article was scheduled for release the day after Mark's party. Emily had a plan. She sat near the back of the ballroom and watched Mark be lauded. She overheard colleagues praise his business acumen and leadership. She noticed his boss clink glasses with him and say, "We're proud to have you leading this team." Emily felt nothing for the applause. Instead, she felt the slowly building thrill of a narrative arc about to be corrected. When she left, she did so deliberately, not to make a scene in the ballroom, but to control the timing of influence. She went home, opened her laptop and posted a brief message on her own social channels. We can celebrate leadership, but leadership is also moral accountability. Sharing my story tomorrow in it, Leela writes, because truth is the foundation of growth. She clicked send. It was mild. It was enough. The article hit the next morning. It was a careful piece that threaded lessons with evidence. Leela had written about how often companies promote charm and results without investigating the integrity behind private behavior. She had used Emily's story as a case study, but the article's thrust was systemic. It called for organizations to consider the whole person they elevated. It did not name the company, but the hints were enough for people who knew the industry to connect the dots. Leela's piece spread in the niche social circles of tech mid-management, then outward into a local business blog. People began to whisper. Mark's phone started to ring with questions that evening. At the office, his assistant asked him if everything was all right. There were awkward conversations about office culture. The company, worried about optics, convened an HR review. The review was discreet and, to Mark's horror, thorough. For the first time in months, he had to answer not just to his conscience and his wife's folly, but to the people who had a tangible influence on his career. Emily watched the cascade with the detached satisfaction of a scientist observing an experiment succeed. But she did not stop there. She understood how fragile social capital was. She also knew that true retribution needed more weight than whispers. She had learned during the fellowship that leverage came from credibility, and from being the person who could demonstrate both harm and change. So she did something colder and more public. She collected receipts and emails and confidential notes from their counselor, with his permission, that corroborated a timeline of behavior. She made a small dossier and sent it to a board member she had met through the fellowship who sat on a corporate ethics panel. She wrote a letter not asking for sanction, but asking for an equitable review of promotion criteria. The letter was professional and devastating in its clarity. The company, embarrassed and nervous about a public scandal, paused Mark's advancement. It was not the humiliating firing Emily might have desired in a rage. It was a bureaucratic freeze that made his life more precariously uncertain. He watched as a promotion that had already been announced was postponed, as emails were asked to be saved, as HR began to ask questions that had the potential to unravel his narrative of success. The momentum beneath his feet stalled like a train switching tracks. Mark turned to Emily with a new face, frantic and small. She had known, when she decided to send out the dossier, that some friends might call it cruel. She had waited for a version of herself that sought revenge for its own sake. This wasn't that. She had decided she wanted to prevent a man from being unchecked, from climbing a ladder that would let him teach others the wrong lessons. Her action was less a personal attack than a moral intervention. And yet the feminine part of her, the private part that still nursed the memory of tentative tenderness, had not entirely hardened. She still wanted him to be better. She wanted him to see the consequences and to accept them. In the solitude of the nights, when the city was quiet and the dog slept with one ear cocked, she sometimes wondered if he would learn the lessons she was forcing upon him, or if he would merely rage and rebuild a life anew where he refused to see what he'd done. Meanwhile, within their social circle and beyond, Emily's reputation grew in an unexpected way. Some whispered that she had orchestrated a public ruin of a man who had loved her. Others said she had performed an act of civic courage. The nuance was messy and human, but the important thing for Emily was not the opinion but the truth finally acknowledged, that even ordinary lives had boundaries and that violations had consequences. Mark's career did not end that night. Corporations are adaptive, they weather scandal when they can quantify risk and patch systems. Yet he lost momentum. The delayed promotion cost him trust among peers. It cost him a year of compensation that would have padded his retirement and given him the sheen of leadership he so desired. He resented Emily in ways he could no longer easily hide. There were fights that became longer and less convincing. He scapegoated his stress, his travel, the demands of his role. He tried to bully his way back into control, but Emily had learned to meet his bluster with documents and deadlines. She was not cruel, she was precise. As the dust settled, Emily took another decisive step. She instituted a small ritual of her own. Once a month she would hold what she called the audit, an evening where she and Mark would review their finances, their commitments, and their progress toward a list of agreed-upon goals. It was not meant to be punitive, it was meant to be transparent. Mark hated the formality but complied. If he skipped a therapy session, Emily noticed. If he spent lavishly without notice, she recorded it. The audit translated betrayal into measurable behaviors, compounding the consequences of broken trust into everyday life. There were dangerous moments, of course. After every humiliation, some part of Mark wanted to make someone else hurt. He called her friends to plead his case, tried to undermine her at the non-profit, and suggested that she was opportunistic. Emily kept her poise and let their own lives be the proof of her character. Each public defense he attempted made more private defenders of Emily's choices. The revenge had begun to do two things. It had altered Mark's career trajectory, and it had accelerated Emily's ascent. She was gaining a role that would allow her to build programs for disenfranchised youth across the region and secure funding for causes she cared deeply about. As she secured her professional foothold, she also began to invest in the house, painting, repairs, planting bulbs in the yard. Her revenge had texture. It wasn't all headlines and dossier drops. It was the small, domestic things that read as stability and design. There is a special kind of satisfaction when someone who has wronged you watches the life they thought would always be available to them become unfamiliar. Mark, who had once assumed Emily's compliance, now had to negotiate for even the smallest conveniences. He would text her with requests for money for an emergency he had created himself by bad planning. She would reply with a budget and an invoice. She did not humiliate him by publicizing his mistakes. She administrated them. The ledger remained precise, unromantic, and quietly punitive. But the revenge that matters most was not punitive in the classic sense. It was corrective. Emily began to see herself not as a victim who needed to be avenged, but as an author who needed to rewrite the ending. Her ambition came with a tenderness for herself, for the young women she met in the fellowship, for anyone who had been taught to measure their worth by another's fidelity. In the months that followed, the community around them watched a strange transformation. A marriage that had once been a picture of ordinary ease became a site of negotiation, and eventually, a new kind of honesty. Mark attended therapy more regularly. He got honest about why he had sought attention outside the marriage and began to confront the weaknesses that had made him look elsewhere: boredom, a fragile ego, and a refusal to discuss needs. Emily's revenge, in large part, had forced him to face those parts of himself he had kept tucked into private drawers. At the same time, Emily's life took on a new color. She traveled internationally for the first time for a conference. She met with funders who wanted someone who had lived through the kind of moral complexity she could now articulate. She made enemies, too, people who resented the public unmasking, but she made more allies. Her career accelerated in ways that had nothing to do with revenge. The quiet victory she had been cultivating came to a head when she signed a contract for a long-term program that would make her financially and symbolically independent. On the night she celebrated the contract with a few colleagues, Mark texted her a photo of a bouquet at the front door with a note. "I want to make this right." Emily read it and smiled with a calm that was not condescending. She had learned that the most eloquent replies are often the ones that act rather than speak. She told him, "You can show me with your actions," and then she went out to celebrate with people who would hold her steady in the next chapter. The thrill of revenge had passed. In its place was the clean joy of possibility, a life remade and a ledger that now had a new line. Emily Hart, free, purposeful, and in charge of what came next. If there is a moment that defines Emily's victory, it is not the scandal or the promotion paused in an HR office. It is not the article that made the tech circles whisper. It is a kind of small domestic magic, and also a public finale, where kindness, competence, and a hardened sense of dignity coalesce into triumph. By the third year after the photograph in the coat, Emily had a schedule full of meaningful work, board meetings, travel to implement youth job literacy programs, and a small team she led with a clarity and compassion that made her colleagues fiercely loyal. She was often away. Mark's career had stabilized into a new pattern, competent, cautious, less daring but less prone to moral flurries. He had stopped dating the woman from the photograph. Whether that was a matter of choice or convenience, Emily could not fully say. In the quiet of Saturday mornings, when Rufus would pad across the hardwood and nap on the rug, Emily sometimes allowed herself to imagine a life entirely unrelated to Mark. She considered moving to a condo in the city, cutting the mortgage ties and starting a new household. She considered a simple life, just herself, a good book, and the steady hum of work that meant something. These daydreams were acts of courage. The inciting final event came like a piece of fate dressed in practicality. Emily had been approached to chair a conference panel on ethical leadership in the age of distraction. The audience would be a mixture of corporates, academics, and non-profit leaders. Panelists included more than one person whose career Emily respected. She accepted immediately. It was, she understood, an opportunity to articulate everything she'd learned, the costs of private indiscretion, the importance of transparency, and the power of structural accountability. She wanted to set a tone that recovery was possible but required public courage. She invited Mark to attend, not to be part of her panel but as a member of the audience. She could have excluded him, she could have performed a flourish of estrangement. Instead, she invited him in because she wanted him to be witness to the new life she had forged, and because she believed, at root, in people's ability to change when held accountable. The night of the panel arrived. The hall was full with a buzz that felt both earnest and anxious. Emily sat with the other panelists and spoke with the calm conviction of someone who had been baptized in consequence and emerged resolute. She told stories about leadership being more than a KPI. She spoke about mistakes, and then, with the clarity of one who had lived through it, about the structures that allow mistakes to hide. After the panel, in the whispering glow of the lobby, people came to her with compliments and handshakes, and the little confessions of men and women who admitted they had navigated their own moral failures. A young woman approached Emily, tearful and relieved, thanking her for saying what she could not. "You gave me language for what happened," the young woman said. Emily hugged her and felt the profound warmth of conviction overlapping with triumph. Mark sat across the room, watching. He was not the picture of a man in ruin, he was the picture of a man who had been resized by consequences. He found her after the crowd thinned and said simply, "You were brilliant." Emily met his eyes. "Did you come because you wanted to learn or because you wanted to make amends?" "Both," he said, and the word carried more humility than it had when he had used it in therapy. "Then keep learning," Emily replied. "I want you to live a life that would make you proud to have made me proud." They talked not like the terrible, recriminating nights of the past, but like two adults measuring the possibility of partnership. There was no drama, there was honest accounting. Mark apologized again with a steadier voice and discussed what real commitment would look like: consistent therapy, transparency with calendars, agreed upon boundaries. Emily listened. She did not accept or refuse, she catalogued. She had become a woman who did not make hard decisions but smart decisions. Outside the conference center, the night smelled of cold and streetlights. Emily walked to the car with Mark, who had grown quieter with age and contrition. For a long time, people tell themselves stories, romantic ones about forgiveness happening in a single cinematic scene, but life rarely revolves around a single decisive moment. Forgiveness, when it exists, is usually the product of repeated patterns and the slow rebuilding of trust. Emily had chosen from the beginning to make respect and autonomy her priorities. She wanted to be loved by someone who had earned the right to be close. What she did next was satisfyingly practical. She took the house and technology discussions, the finances, the considerations of life shared and life separate, and mapped them into a plan, a separation of property and a trial period in which they would live apart but remain married for the time being, to continue therapy and see whether the trust could be rebuilt. It was not a finale dramatic enough for movies, but it was the kind of victory that changed lives. She moved into a smaller condo near a train line, keeping the Craftsman house as a neutral asset for the meantime. She also set up a trust for Rufus, because animals are family and deserve thoughtful arrangements. Mark reacted with a surprising mixture of relief and grief. He wanted the life they'd had and resented that it was gone, but he also seemed to accept the scaffolding Emily provided. It was, perhaps, the only fair result. He had to earn back what he had taken for granted, one small trust at a time. Months passed. The trial separation became a season, then a year. Mark completed a program in executive coaching. He volunteered for causes where he had to answer to beneficiaries rather than profit margins. He met with a mentor, and in small ways his life changed. He kept his promises in ways that could be measured. Counseling sessions were logged, finances were transparent, and most importantly for Emily, his contact with the woman from the photograph ceased and was replaced by a genuine attempt to be present at home more frequently. Emily's revenge, when examined purely as a punitive enterprise, had succeeded. He had been made to pay the cost in stalled promotions and a changed social standing. But the truest measure of her victory was that she had built something better than the life she had lost, a life of productive work, agency, and joy that did not hinge on his approval. She had become the person who could walk into a room and command respect, because she had weathered consequences with dignity and intelligence. One late autumn afternoon, Emily received an award from a regional non-profit coalition, celebrating leaders who had transformed their organizations to be more inclusive and accountable. At the ceremony, the room carried the undertone of communal recognition. Some of the audience members had been her students in workshops. Some were funders who had been persuaded to commit resources. Her acceptance speech was short, a thank you to mentors and a nod to the hard lessons that had refined her. When she looked at the crowd, she saw Mark in the back. He was there as an invited guest because she believed in witnessing someone's growth. On the drive home, Mark reached across the console, his hand tentative, and took hers. "Emily," he began, his voice muffled by the hum of the tires, "whatever you decide, I want you to know I've learned." She looked at him for a long moment. The music on the radio was low. Rufus's head rested between them like a small, warm truce. Emily tightened her fingers around Mark's hand, not because she wanted to reconcile in the old way, but because she recognized the fragile work of human change. A part of her felt tender. A part of her felt triumphant. She had engineered a life that gave her the choice. "Keep learning," she said again softly, "and keep proving it." They drove in quiet companionship toward the house, two adults who had navigated infidelity, public scrutiny, and the slow resculpting of trust. The ending of their story was not a definitive bow but a new beginning. For Emily it was more than revenge fulfilled, it was a life reclaimed, elegantly and immutably hers. In the years that followed, the story of Mark and Emily was not a cautionary tale told at cocktail parties. It was a case study in ethics classes and small group workshops. Sometimes it was told as a warning, sometimes as a testament to the possibility of transformation. But to Emily, it was simply the archive of a life lived deliberately. Mark never again took Emily's presence as something guaranteed. He never again assumed that a hand extended in apology would suffice. He worked toward a steadier version of himself. They did not go back to the naive ease of the early years. Instead, they walked into an adult partnership built on hard-won respect. Days where they negotiated schedules and boundaries. Evenings where they shared stories about work with a candor that rarely bent into betrayal. They taught Rufus new tricks and planted bulbs in the yard that bloomed in the late spring, a promise of renewal. And Emily, who had once thought evidence and ledger and focused retribution would be the end of her story, found, to her growing delight, that what she had built for revenge could be repurposed into joy. Her organization flourished. She mentored women who had been broken by dishonest men, by exploitative bosses, by systematic neglect. Her name became associated with a practical brand of leadership, accountable, principled, and effective. Perhaps the most surprising thing about revenge, Emily discovered, was that it could lead you to a life so good you could forget why you had been angry in the first place. Not that she forgot. She remembered, and she used that memory as fuel. But she also learned to find pleasure in the daily rhythms of being alive on her own terms. A cup of strong coffee on a rainy morning, Rufus's soft snore, the clatter of keys as she typed the next grant application. She learned to be proud without being resentful. The photograph that had started it all sat, in the end, in a small drawer. Sometimes she looked at it and felt a flash of the old pain. But mostly, she felt the satisfaction of someone who had looked at a fault line and decided to build something stronger over it rather than to simply plaster over the cracks. When asked by an interviewer if she had gotten revenge, she would always smile, the smile of someone who had known the cost of a choice and had chosen accordingly. "I took back my life," she would say, "and I taught him how to be accountable. In the end, that was the only revenge that lasted." That night she went to bed with the sense of someone finally in the right place. The revenge she had carried, quiet, steady, exacting, had become a life she loved. The ledger had been balanced, and the balance felt clean. Rufus snuffled into the crook of her arm, and Emily drifted off with a heart that had room to hold both the past and the future. It was not the life she'd expected. It was, she decided, better.